Economic Partnership Agreements, EPAs, seem to be the latest buzzword. They are trade and development agreements negotiated between economic blocs and countries or countries and regions. They are tools to strengthen competitiveness, expand industrialization, improve export performance, and enhance the investment climate. The European Union, previously the world's largest trade union before the Africa Continental Trade Area Agreement came into force, is implementing 7 economic partnership agreements with 32 partners, 14 of them in Africa. The main objectives of the APAs is to leverage trade and investment for sustainable development. The agenda is expanding in substantive terms, with the agreements covering new issues such as services and investment. The EU is sub-Saharan Africa's second biggest trading partner, behind China. And here are a few more points about EPAs. They are tailor-made to suit specific regional circumstances. EPAs are WTO, that's World Trade Organization, compatible agreements. They go beyond conventional free trade agreements to focus on countries' development, taking account of their socio-economic circumstances. EPAs are reciprocal but asymmetrical. They open up the EU's markets to EPA countries fully and immediately, and EPA partners do not pay any tariffs or duties on any of their exports to the EU. EPAs create joint institutions that monitor the implementation of the agreements and address trade issues in a cooperative way. Today's conversation will start by focusing on Kenya and the European Commission signing an interim economic partnership agreement that will guide their trade relations to ensure sustainable development. But it's not just Kenya that the EU has its sights on. Today, we're focusing on the EU seeking a renewed economic partnership with Africa. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adelaru Balogun. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Ken Gichinga. He's the Chief Economist, Mentoria Economics, and of course, a friend of the house. Ken, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tolulope.
So let's start this conversation with the signing of the agreements between Kenya and the European Union. And they've signed this interim economic partnership to boost trade relations between the country and, of course, EU member states. So particularly, even though this is the largest economy on the East African side of things, one of the top 5 economies on the continent, what actually makes Kenya a key starting point, a favorable choice for the EU to kick this off with?
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on. Kenya is the economic hub of the region. It's the largest economy, and it's the headquarters for many of the regional companies based in East Africa. So from that perspective, it makes it easier to have Kenya on board, if only to be able to bring the other 10 member states into these kind of partnerships. Now, obviously, Kenya has that responsibility, and particularly right now, when President Uhuru Kenyatta is the president of the East Africa community, there is extra responsibility to make sure that the needs of the community, particularly Tanzania, that has always had protectionist policies, are kind of complied with. So I think in the fullness of time, it's that perennial search of a win-win solution that can work for the EU, but also work for the East African community and Kenya.
All right, so particularly we know that this agreement is open to the rest of the East Africa community, but particularly for Kenya now that has signed this agreement, what is there to gain? There have been some concerns stated, particularly from the flower farmers. We've seen that in regards to maybe the issue of some pesticides that are allowed, that are not allowed in the EU, but are maybe in use in Kenya. So there are still some concerns about the potential for this, as you say, to be a win-win situation. What does Kenya gain?
Well, you're absolutely right. Particularly, there has been concern among the flower farmers because the EU has quite rigorous standards on what level of pesticides should be used on flowers. And not just flowers, but a lot of the other horticultural products. So if some happy sweet spot is arrived between this negotiation, it can definitely help Kenya and foreign exchange. Obviously, the big answer to your question is If Kenya can export more goods, it's able to gain more dollars, which is good for its reserves and it's good for its balance of payments. And almost entirely all economic partnership agreements, all economic agendas, at the end of the day, is to be able to get that dollars into the national economy, so to stabilize the currency, to improve the balance of payments, and to be able to be in that strong economic position.
So we'll get to the issue of Tanzania specifically, but right now, who else is in line to sign it? Tanzania has been the one holding up the EPA agreement that could be signed with the East Africa community as a regional bloc. But aside from Kenya, who's looking at coming on board with this?
Well, these discussions have actually been going on for the last 8 years, since 2014. And they are not easy discussions because there are two schools of thought that prevail. The first school of thought typically says is pushing towards more globalization, more global partnerships. But there's also another school of thought that wants to protect the local industry, that wants to protect local farmers, particularly farm produce tends to be the most affected. And right now, as Kenya is entering into a political year, it's even more profound when farmers form a very big part of the voting bloc in the region. But all the other countries, but remember, Kenya used to run a trade surplus in the region, but nowadays runs a trade deficit. Kenya has been flooded by products from Uganda, products from Tanzania, and they might be having that tension on what that could mean, because Kenya is a very lucrative market for those East African countries. But I think in that sense, in that spirit of trying to come together, you might find the closest allies like Uganda, Rwanda, trying to really come through to that.
So there are 6 members of the EAC: Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Uganda, and Tanzania. And the particular agreements with the EU for the regional bloc can only be entered into if it is signed and ratified by all 6. Now, Kenya and Rwanda have been putting that pressure on Tanzania, but Tanzania has been holding out. And as you said, this is an agreement that's 8 years in the making, but it seems a change in government is what is likely going to possibly finally get Tanzania to sign off. We know that former President John Magufuli was, as you said, more protectionist. And we're seeing that this new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, has a bit of a more liberal economic outlook. In particular, before now, what were the concerns that Tanzania had that had them holding out for so long?
Well, I think Tanzania and Magufuli appreciated that the country is endowed in factors of production, in land, in labor, in natural resource. And there was a feeling that if those factors of production are put to good use, then the country can create more jobs for Tanzanians and more natural wealth, which is a fair assessment. And it's an assessment that is continuously also canvassed here in Kenya, where we have high levels of unemployment. People always asking, why are we importing everything in these countries, from these countries? If you look at the food basket, the wheat, the breads, all these things are imported. And there's a sense of anger when people say we have all the land to cultivate these things, we have all the labor, we have young unemployed people, but unless we're able to protect these elements, we will never be truly free. So it's a very strong argument that you can't wish away. I think what the other school of thought tries to argue is what is called the competitive advantage, that if it's cheaper for it to be manufactured abroad, then it's better. You have competitive advantage if it can be done in another country. So those are the two main concerns on both sides, really around which economic model at the end of the day is more superior.
All right, so Ken, we're going to take a break because the criticisms of the EPAs, particularly as it is with the African countries, are deep. And it's not just John Magufuli, but another former Tanzania president who listed a few. And I want to see that in the 8 years till now, have some of these issues been addressed? Is it now a situation where there's also an equal partnership, not just a competitive advantage and one party gaining, but an equal partnership for all of the parties involved. So, John, so Ken, please hold the line. This is a conversation looking at how the EU, that is the European Union, is attempting to renew its economic partnership agreements with Africa, starting with Kenya and expanding to the regional bloc there, the East Africa Community. But not everybody is seeing everything eye to eye. We'll resume the conversation after this. My guest today is Ken Gichinga. He's the chief economist for Mentoria Economics. Now, the criticisms of the EPAs are deep, and of course, they are as old as the agreement is. Some 8 years now. Former Tanzanian President Benjamin Mkapa gave concrete reasons in 2016 why the regional EPA would not benefit the country. He said when the EPAs implemented, 335 of the 983 products currently produced would be protected in the EPA's sensitive list, but 648 tariff lines would be made duty-free. That is, the existing industries on this 648 tariff lines would have to compete with the EU's imports without the protections of tariffs. That's the question he asked. While these sectors, would they also be able to survive the competition? The former president also warned of another aspect of the treaty that lies in previous colonial models of Western countries importing raw materials, not manufactured goods. He stated that the African market buys the EAC's manufactured goods and not the European market, which takes 91% of its trade with EAC in primary commodity exports like coffee, tea, spices, fruit, vegetables, and fish. And the EPA prohibits signatories from introducing new export taxes or increasing existing ones. And Tanzania and other EAC countries have rich deposits of cobalt and other minerals, and the inability to levy taxes on natural resources such as these would run against the region's objective to industrialize and add value to the resources. Let me bring Ken back into this. And so the former president of Tanzania listed a whole litany of things that he was concerned about: the tariff lines, the ability to, of course, levy on the natural resources and materials, even having a sort of a colonial mindset to this, bringing in manufactured goods and not raw materials. So from the time when he listed these out, 2016, with this study in 2014, and now Kenya picking this up in 2022, have these issues been adequately addressed?
Some have, particularly in the agricultural space. I think, particularly if you look at a country like Tanzania that has enormous agricultural potential, the progress they made in the agricultural space, empowering farmers and really being able to supply markets such as Kenya and markets such as Uganda. So I think that has been a particular area, and that's why I think that normally it gives that push towards, can we support a bit more of the local farmers, the local producers? But that said, as you said, sometimes there's that colonial relationship that sometimes tends to undermine this relationship, where raw produce is exported to Europe and it's re-imported back, and everybody asks, is there a day that we'll be able to do a bit of value addition?
Yes.
Do the value addition in Kenya, in Tanzania, in the region? That conversation sometimes doesn't get as much currency as it does, but it's becoming increasingly important, particularly when you look at the unemployment numbers.
All right, so let's look at our relationship with the people who we're in this partnership with. We've seen a progressive shift away from aid to more of trade and investment as engines of growth, job creation, and poverty reduction. Are these EPAs really shaping up now to be equal partnerships? Of course, we're not expecting maybe a full 50-50, but is there more of an exchange happening now than there used to be?
I think so. I believe so. You're absolutely right. The whole traditional developmental aid approach doesn't seem to be yielding a lot of fruit. And there's a new conversation towards creating markets being more sustainable and creating a win-win solution. So it's case by case, it's low, it's not in every sector, but we're starting to see people thinking about market-based solutions where both investors and the recipients are able to have that meaningful relationship. So I think it's still work in progress. Lots of conversations have to take place, but already we are starting to see some subsectors starting to thrive, particularly on that particular angle.
All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that happens to be China. Now, given the presence of this tiger in the continent, or rather on the continent in the past couple of decades, we've seen loans, we've seen infrastructural developments as well. And there's a competition we've seen going on between the East and the West and how they're fighting for the resources and dominance on the African continent. Do you think these EPAs offer any sort of competition to what China is offering the continent, or they're different parts of the game altogether?
Well, Tolulupe, the theory of trade is normally anchored on what is called competitive advantage. Things being done where it's cheapest and the least resources used. And what China has is often it has a competitive advantage in almost everything, in particular those big because of the low cost of cheap labor, low cost of energy. So it is a major entity that has to be discussed from a trade perspective. I think what the EPAs will bring is diversity. I think what people are starting to realize post-COVID is even if you have a competitive advantage in one area, it's always good to have a diversity of suppliers. Because if, for example, we saw the supply chains in China when that port had the COVID issues and we saw major supply chain problems, I think people are starting to realize that you can't all depend on one source on products. You need to have a variety of sources. So in the event that there's a crisis in one part of the world, like right now we have the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and we are seeing that the price of wheat might be very expensive. We need to have another place where we can source for cheap wheat. So I think the world is realizing that things are unpredictable. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. So when it comes to doing trade, have as many partners and try to keep a wide array of partners.
So it was the African Continental Free Trade Area that displaced the European Union as the largest trading bloc in the world. And we're seeing this is a year after the AFTA agreement has come into being. There's still a number of things that need to be done to fully bring it into force. But what is the signing of an EPA with Kenya or an EPA with a regional bloc such as the EAC? What does it mean for the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? Even some of these EPAs have very lax rules on rules of origin. But we're seeing that is something that the agreement is trying to be very tight on so that African countries do not lose out. So how do we balance the two? Or is there a compromise to be found?
Well, that's a very powerful question. And there are policymakers who believe everything has to be anchored on the African continental free trade. I personally don't believe that. I think it's more of a futuristic thing because, as you said, there are so many things that need to happen before it even resembles the EU. So we do need the smaller communities in the region, not just because it's easier to manage a particular region, but the continent is very diverse. East Africa and West Africa, there's so many non-tariff barriers. We talk about tariff barriers, but non-tariff barriers of language, culture, and business practices that for me, the full continental agreement is a long way out. I think it will be the fullness of time when all these regional sub-blocks are able to mature and come together. That's only then that will happen. So I think right now we have to focus on the East African community. I think that's the immediate neighbors. Obviously, DRC is joining the community, and it's going to be huge in terms of what it brings to the community. And the dynamics are changing. So I think that's where the real action will be. But I believe possibly in many years to come, the full continental trade agreement might be a bit more feasible.
All right. And finally, what do you think is going to take Tanzania to sign on the dotted lines and let this thing come into full force, particularly the regional agreement with the EU?
Well, they have had a change of presidency, and Samia Suluhu appears a bit more liberal in her economic approach. So it might not take much. I think Kenya is assisting on that end to that effect. But what Tanzania would want to see is practices that do not flood the markets with cheap products because the country believes that they have enough of what it takes to be able to prepare and bring and to manufacture these products. So any attempt to flood these markets with cheap imports, I think will be repelled. And I think a lot of the conversation will be around that point.
All right, and we'll watch it to see how it plays out. Ken, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Enjoy a fine sunny day in Nairobi, Kenya. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
All right. And it is, of course, interesting to see how the EU is extending its hand for new features with the EPAs. We also know, of course, when the United Kingdom exited the Union, that is, of course, with Brexit, they started trying to form their own EPAs with African countries and regional organizations. It is a competitive race and one that does have competitive advantage at the very forefront. But at the end of the day, what will benefit Africans the most? That's what we should all be looking for. NC4 to Watch is up next, and these are stories we're keeping our eyes on. Stay with us. And let's get you a few stories that we're watching to see how they play out. Now, the partnership between Tanzania and Shell seems to be progressing well. Oil major Shell has affirmed this and adds that the Tanzanian government in recent months has made some advances in the liquefied natural gas LNG projects in order to tap the East African country's huge gas resources. Morocco's Royal Air Maroc plans to launch a new Casablanca-Tel Aviv route on March 13th. This announcement comes after Israeli Economy Minister Orna Babeva paid an official visit to Morocco as the two countries look to broaden cooperation since they normalized ties in 2020. South Africa's telecoms regulator, ICASA, says that all 6 applications it received from telecom firms have qualified to participate in a radio frequency spectrum auction, a process slowed by years of legislative delay. The regulator said that the qualifying bidders are MTN, Vodacom, Telkom, Cell C, Rain Networks, and Liquid Telecoms. And finally, gold led a broad rally in commodities after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that he's recognizing 2 self-proclaimed separatist republics in eastern Ukraine and plans to send peacekeeping forces to the region in a dramatic escalation of the conflict. And he has done just that. Spot gold climbed to $1,908.70 an ounce after earlier hitting $1,914.25 an ounce, and that's the highest intraday level since June 1st, 2021. And we're watching things very closely to see how they play out. So don't forget to join us at 1 p.m. West African time for Beyond the Continent. And we'll have the latest updates with the escalation of things in the Eastern European part. And of course, at 12 o'clock, News Central Now gives you all the latest news from here on the continent and beyond. I'm Tolu Lokpe Adileru Balogun. Have a fantastic day.